Hey, Tim.
Hi, how are we all today?
Um, Pretty well, I think. I think it's
Oh,
I mean well, yeah, we were just talking about the box controversy. I don't really care one way or the other. I had a very busy week. I spent most of my time putting together a grant proposal for a $25,000 grant to implement what they call Z degrees, or actually to explore whether we could implement what they call Z degrees at my university. Z degrees are programs that have a path through them that has zero textbook cost, and obviously it works better in some disciplines than in others, and the state legislature in Minnesota had sort of authorized monies to do this a couple of years ago, and they initially focused on the system. Initially, kind of focused on the community colleges, and because everyone figured it was easier to do a 2-year program, an associate's degree program, and eliminate the textbook expense or the course material expense, and that was an area that would there would be a significant effect for because we have a lot of first generation uh, college students. So hey Nate, hey Chris. So now after a couple of years we finally opened it to, now that there actually are several Z degree programs in the 2-year schools where people can get associate's degrees. We've sort of opened it to people who want to take that associate's degree and complete a bachelor's degree at the universities. The system office finally said, okay, you can go ahead and ask. You can go ahead and at least
so
put in a.
so I would, given I think with Lewis and his uh, sinky, snowy base is off sick, stroke, not overworked and all the rest of it. I probably need to warn you guys. It looks like the start of a revolution has happened, UK wise.
Oh yeah.
Some Ponzi new money person, i.e., a hedge fund guy, has over the last however many years, slowly but surely, been buying up some land. Some of that land is in a national park. So our national parks are areas with different rights rather than different ownership. And those rights are semi-enumerated, as in there are do's and there are don'ts for what you can do in each separate national park, because they're not all equal. But Dartmoor, I think, was the first, or is one of the oldest. And the wording on the Dartmoor Act, which is just about pre-World War II, I think, from memory, basically says you can enjoy the fresh air. And this guy has said, and the court has accepted, because, of course, he's been doshing out money to right-wing parties, left, right, and centre, including his local MP, who knows the judge, etc., says the enumerated rights for the Dartmoor Act do not include camping. So you've all of a sudden, not just his land, but the whole of the national park has, oh, what do you mean you can't camp? We've always been camping ever since the Act, particularly since the Act. And the other one for the UK is, once the footpath has been established, providing it's used once every X years, like 20 years or something, the landlord can't change it, or the landowner can't change it easily. However, you have to be conscious of the damage to the crops. So if it's diagonally across the field and there's no established trackway, you have to walk around the edge.
Mhm.
If there's an established trackway, you can go across the diagonal. Or they actually signpost it and mow it out in some crops.
Mhm.
Because the landlords are not all bastards. Right?
Yeah, I remember
Quoted an
reading
Irish-
about that when I was a kid. I read a story in which people were some teenagers were making a beeline across Wales or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's also national park type things that aren't really national parks that you've got, rather like something like the Appalachian Way, is a signposted route that is free, open, and all the rest of it.
Mhm.
Some of the ones in the UK are 6 to 7 to 8,000 years old. And one of the best well-known ones is the Ridgeway. It joins up just outside Stonehenge to somewhere in Hertfordshire called Tring. And I know the middle bit quite well because that's going over like the Marlborough Downs, which is where the Cotswolds limestone
Mhm.
meets the chalk downs that you see on the White Cliffs of Dover.
Yeah.
And there's an escarpment just near near Avebury, where you drive up this slow slope. I mean, it's one of the few hairpin bends in southern UK. There's a couple of other ones. And one of those is near Toll Puddle, which is where the martyrs came from, of course. That's actually called Zigzag Road because it zigzags. Anyway, so the judges decided in this particular case, which was only a couple of weeks ago, that the unenumerated rights don't exist. The Act doesn't say you can camp, but the Act also, because Dartmoor's quite a rocky place, there's a lot of these tours because Dartmoor's sort of our old bit of volcanism area.
Mhm.
So there's all these granite, really big, lumpy granite tours that
Mhm.
are great for rock climbing. And you see them on things like the Topographic Oceans album cover,
Right. Yeah.
and lots of places. There's even one called Yes Tour, right? Yes. The enumerated rights don't include bird watching or standing still or rock climbing. So apparently you can't do that either. So it reminded me of a early episode of The West Wing, where Bartlett had finally got a seat on the Supreme Court to fill and was going to have it filled by this well-known, classical, educated judge. And then somebody let the White House know that he'd written a rather semi-racist piece, but about the right to privacy, as in you have, because the right to privacy is not enumerated, you don't have it. And so the Sam Seaborns and the Toby Zieglers of the world were up in arms about this. And they brought this judge in. And he wrote this when he was like 26 years old, doing the editorial of the Harvard newsletter called All Fiction. And they ended up with picking this unusual judge who'd been a copper or a policeman, because you don't know what a copper is. Been a policeman, invalided out because he got shot in the leg, took a desk job because he didn't want to leave the police, but put himself through law school, and then became, as far as the West Wing was concerned, the most unchallenged judge in the state of New York, I think it was, or something. He's like, the comment was, it looks like you're right 75% of the time. And I was thinking then, of course, we don't have a constitution in that sense in the UK.
Right.
And But we have all these acts that have enumerations, and a lot of the time, the gaps or the excesses are always put down as being, yeah, but nobody's going to do that, or nobody's going to say that, or nobody's going to action that. And it's the same as in one of my court cases. Way back when we were tendering for a job, I said, I don't like this clause because it makes us, we were specialists in test and commissioning the mechanical systems. It makes us responsible for everything, including the soil testing that's already been done. The project's well underway. And the concrete, because it makes us severally and equally liable for everything. You know, somebody decides the window's wrong, could be our fault. And they go, oh no, it'll never come up. And it did. 5 times in the court case, they tried to make us responsible for things that we didn't even touch, right? Let alone actually did. Anyway, so, and then of course, you've now got the Fifth Circuit judgment that those people being bashed about shall not have their firearms rights being restricted. And that sounds like an absolute nightmare. You know, I'm under stress because somebody's beating the shit out of me, so I go buy a gun and shoot him. How does that suddenly stop being premeditated murder? If I'm under the stress of being beaten, I can't presumably claim self-defense as a item after 24 hours before I went out and got a couple of AR-15s and some magazines full or whatever. Sounds like it's a nightmare.
John, you want to respond?
I think he
I
does.
just had a question about the book.
About this book?
Yes.
Okay. I think Tim, I think what you're talking about kind of, you know, in these sort of unenumerated rights kind of is a good segue into what we're going to cover. I think we're going to cover the first section today, right?
I try.
All right. Thank you. So John, you want to start us off with that segue?
Well, yeah, it's more of a process. I mean, you as a historian have read a lot of these kinds of things. Is written kind of the way that Graeber talks. I've seen him talk about this topic. But how do you handle this sort of stream of facts that he's presenting here as a historian?
I thought this was much more like a history than something like The Dawn of Everything. So I was fairly comfortable with this idea because I think this is the type of thing that you see a lot in histories, you know, where somebody is trying to complicate an accepted narrative or give some type of counter, present some type of counter narrative that points out the things that are missed. So it struck me that it kind of worked for me, that he's saying, okay, this is what I found. Several times he corrects things that are not, well, he couldn't have been there because he was long dead, kind of thing. So some factual, stuff. I thought my reaction was not that I'm ever entirely convinced when somebody, kind of presents this, type of counter argument. I always want to, check the sources and read other perspectives and stuff, but I didn't think it was unusual. I mean, how did other people feel about it?
Yeah, Dan, I happen to be watching the serialized 1619 project, whatever the
Mhm.
and for some reason the combination of reading this and watching that and some of the claims made there about how the country came to be and reminded, I mean, there was some similarity in this kind of counter narrative in both cases with, so here's some facts and maybe it didn't really work this way. And I was always interested in asking historian what they thought of that controversy, but that whole approach of just this unexamined or public unawareness, I guess you would say, of some of these things. Anyway, that's just a reaction that I had that was kind of just by chance because of being exposed to those two kind of weird narratives. Well, what I would say at the same time.
Right, that are very both kind of very much challenging a sort of a accepted master narrative that we thought had been nailed down. Yeah, I haven't watched that. Is that on Hulu or where? It's someplace that I don't have. That I'll have to.
Oh, okay.
I'll have to buy a subscription to once again, and I think probably I will do that as like a summer project because it is. I mean, I do work with that. That era of history, and I do kind of some equity oriented work, so I probably should look at that. I suspect, based on some things, brief things that the project had written that I glanced at, and then kind of the general reactions and debate about it, that that probably, I don't know. I'm going out on a limb here again because I haven't really engaged with it. But my feeling about 1619 is that they're probably not wrong on facts, but may be reaching a little bit on kind of connections and causality and sort of the narrative arc of the thing. And the prevalence. I mean, that's always something that you kind of wonder about, right? Is you get this set of sources and you sort of generalize from there that this is what people were doing or this is what people were thinking, right? And so it's hard. I mean, and it's really easy to kind of fall into that. Everybody was thinking this sort of idea. So I think it makes. It makes sense to examine them, but probably again with that one, not to to. I mean, if I were talking to my students, if I were telling my students, okay, it's time to, we're gonna look at this, I would say, and then we're gonna look at something else, right? And similar to this, I think that he, this whole. I think the story that he does here, and I'm noticing in the chat here, yeah, if he could write like this, why didn't he? In Dawn of Everything, and I think this does strike me as kind of a much more straight ahead sort of historical, approach to this, that he has a lot. I mean, he's done a lot of secondary reading, and he's done some some original work as well. Go ahead, Chris.
So this is super interesting from a historical perspective, not only because it's pirates and pirates are fun, which is an interesting thing, and I'm not sure that I think he's doing a good enough job for me yet on some of the history parts, but I think the tough part is he's telling us a lot of this is myth and popular story and things spread, and most of what we've got now are, I remember most of my pirate history through things like Robert Louis Stevenson, who was a century even after all of what he's talking about now. And then lots of crazy pirate movies. But where I have issues is, he talks about Defoe's book, or what we presume is Defoe's book. I pulled up the reference to see if I could read the paper kind of proving Defoe's authorship of this thing, but I haven't gotten to it yet. But is Defoe writing history, or is he, passing on stories he's heard that are passing as history in his time? And how do you tease those two apart as a historian? What's true in fact and provable fact versus not? I think somewhere early in there he says there isn't a whole lot of archaeology that supports this.
Mm-hmm.
So what are and in one or two places he doesn't give specific examples, but he says that, I think somewhere around page 26, that contemporaneous accounts, when they do cover the same material, are conflicting. In fact, actually, I think that was on page 26 in the section about more mock kings, that he actually does kind of a historian's block of, here's how we're going to have to look at this evidence, and it's compounded by the fact that the presumption is the pirates were actively lying and making bigger confabulous stories that we can't trust. So how do you go back into a time period that we don't live in a context that we don't have, and rebuild that context for what was plausible for the time, what would have potentially been made up for their own purposes or not.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the usual historical problems going on, but compounding that, you have unreliable narrators on top of it. So how do you it's hard enough to tease the history pieces apart, but how do you tease apart the unreliable narrator pieces on top of it? And
Yes.
To me, he's not doing a great job of saying this is reasonable concrete fact and this is not, but rather kind of, here's a story from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And a few footnotes here and there, but not enough for me. I would have to do a huge amount of reading to kind of rebuild the context he's coming into it with.
Mm-hmm. I think that I guess my approach to it was, I am going to assume that he has a tremendous desire to find women, as being central in this, in this thing, and having much more agency than anyone is saying that they had, and all that, partially because of his sort of understanding of Malagasy society, in the past and the present, and some of these, these traces that he thinks he's found, and also kind of a sort of a political commitment, right? But even, but having said that, I don't think that means I necessarily distrust it when he brings evidence, right? One of the things that happens a lot is that, and he's mentioned this already a couple of times, Christopher Hill speculated about this, but would only speculate, right? Because, that was, God, when did Hill write? It was like probably 50 years ago, and, or more. And there was a different kind of standard of, of what, how far off the beaten, track you could go and be, and get your stuff published and all of that, and be, and be read. I think that there's a lot of, because one of the things that Hill, if I recall, Hill, I mean, it's been a long time since I read Hill, but I mean, one of Hill's things was that that a lot of the New Model Army, right, ends up going to, all of these officers, right, who have no place after the Restoration, right, go to the Caribbean and become pirates. And, and so there's this whole thing that's going on, in the, the 1650s, 60s, 70s, of this kind of, the rant, and again, also, I mean, little sort of not groups that don't get enough study in, at least as far as I'm concerned, in like English history, right? Ranters and levelers, and all of these people who kind of are on the fringe always of religious movements, and also kind of put social political movements, and so finding them in anything but sort of adversarial records, right? Records of their prosecutions, and when they have their ears and noses cut off and stuff like that, is difficult. Archaeological evidence, I'm not sure what. I don't really understand that. What we
Well, that was mentioned. He's right.
be,
I mean, Chris is right. It was mentioned several times, and I'm thinking, well, take the counterposition. What would one expect to find if some of these claims were true, as opposed to if they, were not?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
well, you go digging on the coast, and you would expect to see if these pirate kingdoms existed and they were hundreds or thousands, you'd expect to find some semblance of buildings or structures there, and whether you do or not,
ruins of palaces and things like that,
or at least a really large midden.
Tombs with well, I mean, that would be an earlier thing, but even so, in that period, if people were buried in a kind of a fashion where it's clear that they're given honors. But I think that he's, I think where he's going with this, isn't it, is that these are that there's kind of a performance and kind of a reality that are different from each other, right? And the performance of, he mentions this at some point, that that on shipboard too, like the pirate captains want to seem like they're gonna, they're dangerous, and they're ruthless, and they're vicious, and you got to be really scared, and obviously that's advantageous if you're sailing up to to an armed ship where people might try to defend themselves against you. But then but then in the reality, in the actual pirate community, right, it is very democratic, right? They'll only take orders from the captain, during pursuit or battle, and the quartermaster has a ton of power in that society, and things happen by consensus, and that's one of the things, and I do think it did impress me that the first blurb is Marcus Rediker, right, who kind of is the king of the pirate historians right now, and he does, he doesn't. I mean, he says he's produced one of the most fascinating, original, and altogether brilliant books ever written about the pirates, and I guess that predisposed me to to maybe taking this very open-mindedly, and not thinking he's just heaping a pile of kind of supposition and illegitimately misinterpreted stuff. It's also, I mean, I think the fact that it happens on the other side of Africa is also really interesting, and also kind of opens us up to, an Indian Ocean history, with the Mughals, and with, this early, because the Portuguese and the Dutch are already over there. So,
yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing too, is you've got a group of people in the center of what is roughly world trade at the time, who are interacting with multiple people in multiple countries with respect to business and court concerns.
mm-hmm.
And he mentions a few things like court documents, or, some of that sort of business.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't, I haven't seen any quotes from it, or kind of curious what those documents actually look like and what they may or may not indicate.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that actually occurred to me was, and it sort of ratcheted up my respect for Neil Stephenson. Because in his in his Baroque trilogy, right, they sail around the world and they go to these places. I think they're close to, at one point they have a little colony, kind of somewhere close to Malacca. I don't remember exactly where, but they're in these waters in this period at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and a lot of it just sort of in tone is very much like this, and so I thought that was because I didn't really have a and I guess by way of full disclosure, the Baroque trilogy was what got me back into grad school for history. So it's all Neil Stephenson's fault. But yeah, these I mean, there are some speculative elements like the John Plantain, how does this connect with the and Mulatto Tom and the young Captain Avery and all of these and is this guy really descended from Baldridge, or does he just take the name?
The one cardinal sin he commits here, he's got a book about pirates, but there is no map of any sort.
Yeah.
Which is just, how do you do this?
Yes. Well, he was dead. So that's his excuse.
Yeah, but some scholar should have come along and said, hey guys, while we're editing this. Now actually, so that's the other thing too, is this is an English translation of a French piece that was published in 2019 prior to his death. So that excuse doesn't hold.
Okay. Did
have
the whole thing really come out in French?
There,
Le Perrot de Lumiere.
There, in the popular press, it's being sold as a posthumous work, with some people, I think, presuming that it was stuff he had in process that someone cleaned up. But he published this before his death.
Okay, that's a good point. That's important to know. Yeah, and it is copyrighted 2019. And I did notice he does say, he refers a couple times to things that he's done in Dawn of Everything.
Yeah. So it is wholly his fault. There is no
fair enough.
Marks the spot.
All right.
He does have like kind of the treasure coin on a a compass rose on the cover, but that probably was a decision posthumously made.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So one of the chapters of The Extended Mind that I thought was most interesting was the one that was talking about like thinking in space and like how we do that kind of thing. And I thought it was really interesting in the preface where he's talking about like having this big document like blown up and being on his wall. And I can't believe that he wrote like this book like without having, a map blown up on his wall somewhere.
I agree.
Yeah, it was in fact, I pulled it off the shelf for my daughter who was doing some work on geology in 6th grade science. And one of the best maps I've ever seen was on Simon Winchester's The Map That Changed the World. And the whole book is about a map, and it has multiple versions of the map inside. But they made the choice to turn the book jacket into a massive map. So the book jacket, if you take it off, it unfolds and becomes this, really nice wall-sized type map that also serves as a book cover. But it gives you a better indication of the places and spaces and times. Most people are going to have to look up a map or look up online to know where Reunion is.
Yeah, right.
Or Mauritius in relation to all of or even these cities and towns along the coast.
Yeah. I found myself wondering about that too. You're right. How far how close are Mauritius and Reunion and Madagascar, and that is relevant. And which ones are ones that you would normally pass by on the shipping lanes, or would you hug the coast of East Africa, or would you shoot directly across the Indian Ocean the way supposedly Vasco da Gama did? I don't know. I mean, where's the wind?
Or a little more about kind of sea travel and how many boats did they actually have?
Mhm.
Because contemporaneous to this, and I didn't really start thinking about it until he was mentioning kind of how outside of the culture you'd have to be to say you took sides with the devil and you
Mhm.
were kind of anti-religious.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what's happening here is contemporaneous with the Salem witch trials,
Mhm.
and presumably one of the targets of the trials was an incredibly rich trader whose fortunes were taken over by the state because he was an accused witch and I think killed, or one of the ones that was killed in the last batch. But his the small amount of value that his family retained after he died was as the result of multiple ships having been out at sea at trade, and so they couldn't be stolen essentially by the local sheriff and the government. So, but it amounted to what would have been, he would have been a multi-millionaire in today's dollars because he had so many ships that were actually out.
Yeah.
So if that's one business person in New England who's trading kind of outside of the space in the late, I think that was what, 1692, 93, the Salem witch trials.
80s
So
or 90s. Yes.
how does that square with the number of ships that privateers, buccaneers, pirates would have had in this space at this time?
And also the people on them. Yeah.
And the people that actually work them and keep them up.
Yeah. And I think that's there's a huge, and that is something that in my reading of the pirates and of Rediker and other people like that, that's a thing, right? That pirate ships tend to be crowded, right? Whereas especially the Royal Navy, right, operates with these skeleton crews. They're running these big ships with maybe a couple dozen people at the most, and that's one of the reasons that that Royal Navy life is such hell, right? And that there are mutinies, and that there is that there are desertions and all of that. So yeah, and that's something that I think as I've been the last kind of semester and a half, I've been doing this U.S. History 1 course with primary sources, and that's one of the things that students remark on a lot, right? Is oh my God, I didn't realize that that when Cabot, right, when John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto came, went from Bristol to Newfoundland, the first time in 1497, he had a crew of like 18. It was a small ship, and these and they talk about different types of ships, and of course everybody knew what a bark was and what a pinnace was and all these things back in the day, but we just think ship and we think like old Ironsides or something. I've been on old Ironsides. The ceilings below decks are built for guys my height or shorter. So yeah. Yeah, I think this opens up a lot of, I think this is going to be one of those books that I am going to return to a lot to kind of follow some of these trails, especially in the bibliography.
Yeah, I'm curious to go back and read the original Defoe. I downloaded a copy of actually found an original scan, a Google Book scan, I think, of the 1724 piece, which,
Yeah.
if nothing else, will be fun, I guess.
Yes. Well, and Defoe is such an interesting character. You know, the plague years and the, you know, and the pirates and just all these things that he kind of, you know, got interested in and stuck his fingers into and then wrote about are just
I thought
fascinating.
also brought up for me too, from the framing of Colin Woodard's American Nations, where he puts the thesis of America was settled in 11 groups that then had a founder effect, and then things grew from there.
Mm-hmm.
You've got groups of pirates who may have figured out individually on individual ships how to run this democracy experiment,
Right.
that they then moved to land, and then potentially was influenced again by the Malagasy peoples on top of that. But where did those senses of government come from originally? If you're talking about multiple people from multiple different places within international trade,
Right.
so your crews are not going to necessarily be from one place. But where is the thing 40 or 50 years prior to piracy that begins to inform this shift? Or was it something that happened completely because you go pirate and you can't go back to your original society? So how do you band together and have some life?
Yeah. Well, and then there's that whole kind of, you know, interface between privateering and piracy. And he does talk at one point about, he calls them freebooters, right? And the classic freebooter is John Hawkins, right? Sir John Hawkins. And he's the son of William Hawkins, who in 1530 was one of the first people who went to the African coast and picked up slaves and brought, you know, and started moving them around the Atlantic world. So John Hawkins, you know, is a freebooter. He's out there, you know, and there's this weird, you know, there's this weird period between the ascension of Elizabeth I in 1567-8, right? And, you know, 20 years later, and she holds off the war with Spain for 20 years. Basically, I mean, she refuses to marry Philip II, although he was, you know, he was married to Mary and he was King of England while he was married to Mary, and he wants to retain that. And so then there's this privateering thing. There's these people, you know, one of the things that Drake does when he goes under, you know, he goes through the Straits of Magellan is, you know, he attacks these undefended ports like Valdivia and Coquimbo and, you know, probably Valparaiso and these, you know, and he finds these, you know, ships filled with treasure because the Spaniards don't expect anybody over that side of South America, right? But Tim, you're right. Zheng He, you know, I use an image in my world history course. I use an image of one of the treasure ships up against, you know, and it's someplace, actually it's someplace in the UAE or in, you know, someplace in your neck of the woods in an airport. There's a glass case with, you know, because Zheng He was a Muslim, they're sort of celebrating him, and they've got a scale model of his treasure ship next to the Santa Maria, which looks like just a tiny little. Yeah.
I've got a picture. I'll fly it up and share it on the screen. But I was about to say the sheer professionalism of what was then the Chinese Empire versus all these little sort of, I've got a bit of spare money, I'll throw it your way, go do this with a few boats, has always amazed me. And it's in the Ibn Battuta shopping mall, which is a relatively long mall, and each section has a different Muslim culture feel. So
Mhm.
at one end you've got Andalusia, and at
Mhm.
the other end you've got China.
Yeah.
And China happens to be where the cinema is, and Andalusia is where the big supermarket is.
Oh,
And
wow.
in between you've got Persia, India,
Oh, so you've got some Sunnis and some Shia.
and so yeah. So and the downside is the public walkway has no visual out, no skylights, no windows, no nothing until you get to the end doors.
Mm.
And so they've basically painted the whole of this walkway ceiling
So it's
is pale blue with white fluffy clouds, which sort of happens here like 10 days a year. But let me find the picture.
Yeah, I would love to, if you can send me a JPEG of that, I would love to use that because I've got one that I'm sort of semi-legally using, claiming fair use, but if I had one that I could.
Oh, since we're talking about pirates, cross my palm with silver, and this is yours.
There you go. Yeah, it's funny because Zheng He, he was huge, right? He helped Zhu Di become the Yongle emperor, right? And deposing his nephew, who Hongwu went to for because he was the son of his favorite son who died, right? And then moving the center of government to Beijing, and beginning building the Forbidden City, and then sending this thing out. And the thing that impresses me the most about the Chinese fleet is that it's not about settler colonialism. It's not even really about trade, right? Because they have all of the resources that they need internally. They have the market that they need internally. So it's about tribute.
So it's all diplomatic and picking up treaties and picking up the you owe us tribute.
Right.
Now,
and they actually kidnap the rulers of Sri Lanka and bring them back to Beijing so they can kowtow. But then they just shower them in gifts.
Oddly enough, Eleanor, who does all the Obsidian newsletter and stuff, I got to her through the word tribute, because she did an early couple of years back. She did one of her big wide-ranging essays on tribute.
Yeah.
But let me share the screen, because it's on my screen, and you can,
I'll make you.
I'll send it to you later.
Okay, hang on a sec. I'll make you a
Yeah, you've got to make me a host.
Participants. Where is it? Hello. Forward to this computer. Thank you. Okay, so what I did while you had control there was I took a screenshot of that. So I'll post the screenshot of that as well. So it's unfortunate we lost the recording there for a couple of minutes while you had control, but we're back. I think the whole thing. Now, Nate, you had this. You just posted this Atlas Obscura thing about Qing Shi, who lived during the Qing dynasty. So then, it's kind of interesting because when the Yongle Emperor dies in 1433, his heirs aren't really that interested. There are a couple more expeditions, according to the Ming Shi Lu, which is the kind of archive of all the official court documents. But then it gets kind of phased out, and almost not that long later, in less than a generation later, one of the emperors is actually kidnapped when he's visiting the north of China, and that sort of prompts this focus. The focus shifts from the sea to the interior, and they begin building what becomes the Great Wall, and all of that. And then there's this, and then obviously, once there are no longer fleets of hundreds of ships, 465 feet long and 160 feet wide, plying the South China Sea and through the Strait of Malacca into the Indian Ocean and all of that, then there's a vacuum. right? And then South China Sea, South China and Japanese pirate, what they call pirates, begin kind of become the center of power there until, of course, the Portuguese arrive and then the Dutch arrive and all of that. But the Ming, that's the Ming, that's in the 15th century. So this one, who I'm not familiar with, seems to be from right at the end, right? Just at the end of the Qing, before
and of course that period, the Elizabethan opening up into James I, is the background, as in England against Spain with Holland on our side, as the Protestants versus the Catholics,
right before the Anglo-Dutch Wars,
is also the background, the secondary background even, to James Cavell's Shogun.
Yeah.
So
his chronology is kind of fuzzy, but yeah.
Yeah. He conflates two things that are 50 years apart.
Yeah.
But the character John Blackthorne, as in Richard Chamberlain on the TV series,
right,
is actually John Adams from Chatham. And John Adams' story is quite nice. He went backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times and had 2 families. And I think when he died, it was in Yokohama. So he's on Yokohama Island, buried. But oddly enough, when I last, but 2 times when I read the series, I was building the John Adams Hospital in Kent.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And I thought, I know that name. Okay, it sort of didn't quite gel straight away. Anyway, you have mail.
I'm sorry? You're muted now. Still can't hear you.
Sorry, you have mail. So,
oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, Chris, you just put the slave ship is interesting. I use that image too. That one of the way they kind of squeeze them in there like sardines. It's just horrendous.
I don't remember if it had dimensions on it, but yeah.
It's not a big ship. It's a couple 100 feet long, as I recall. And it's just So slavery, actually, I mean, and actually that is, probably I didn't really kind of notice it in this part 1, but except a couple of references that that there are people sort of peripherally involved or sort of fighting it. But there's a lot of overlap between these people like not so much Drake, but Hawkins, and and Hawkins actually is Drake's mentor. So I guess there is overlap, right? John Hawkins is his second,
of course,
first cousin and mentor, I think.
At that point, there was no real professional navy.
Well, there kind of was, because Hawkins kind of helped to modernize the Royal Navy just before 1588. So there was the beginnings of some.
But it's not until you get another 80 odd years now that you get the Samuel Pepys's type period of, I've now got to put all the ropes and sails and wood and food and other victuals and cannon, etc., into some sort of proper two-way accounting system to keep a track of it, etc., etc.
Well, yeah, and yeah, I think I agree. It becomes much more organized, and kind of codified.
And just relating on, we're talking pirates, and of course the Trucal States, having jokingly mentioned it because I'm here,
Mhm.
they existed from about 1820 to stop the pirates. As in, we will look after you if you stop pirating,
Mhm.
because that was the low-level asymmetric war mode of the region. And
Mhm.
you know, we now got the problem with Somalia, which is not that far away.
Mhm.
But what I find interesting is that making the Trucal States didn't happen virtually all at once, and the last place to become part of the Trucal States is on the other side of the peninsula, in terms of it's only facing the Indian Ocean, whereas all the early ones face inward to the Arabian Gulf.
Mm.
Please don't say Persian Gulf, because even things like the National Geographic, which persistently says Persian Gulf, gets a big black line through it. That and side boobs on shower adverts are the things that get edited out of things like The Economist and The Telegraph. And
That's interesting.
yet, when I first came, everybody said about the day-to-day repression. And then I went back into Saudi, as in another level of control.
Mm.
And I went into the main bookshop in Jeddah, and what do I see? Chris Hitchens on sale. As in, of all the people you could imagine,
Of all the
he's got to be
anti-Muslim
the last.
Westerners.
And yeah, and it's like, it's not just anywhere. You're 20 miles from Mecca,
Yeah.
right?
No. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't realize the Trucal States were named after the truce, the General Maritime Treaty of 1820. I just looked them up. Yeah, so
yeah, I mean, you stop your day-to-day pirating. Will be the military oversight. You don't need, so you can focus on your pearls and your fishing and your palm trees, because there's no oil back then.
Yeah,
or nothing to speak of.
Yeah, and you know, and so I mean, one of the things that actually kind of excites me about this sort of thing is that, you know, it just shows how much more there is, you know, and as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, yeah, there, you know, 1803 and 4, you know, Jefferson sends, you know, the American fleet against the, you know, the Barbary pirates. Right. And, you know, and there's got to be just layer upon layer upon layer that you could, you know, kind of burrow down into that, you know, a story like that as well. It does strike me that, you know, and also things that we sort of think we know and sort of take for granted, but, you know, but don't really pay that close attention to, like, you know, Moby Dick. Right, they're sailing, you know, you've got these people in New England, in New Bedford, and, you know, and on the islands, and all the people initially on like Nantucket, I think originally are like Quakers, and so you've got these populations, and they become, you know, seafarers, and they end up, you know, having connections with places like Valparaiso, you know, on the other side of the, I mean, long way away, and sailing into the Pacific, you know, in search of whales is, to me, not that unlike, you know, the Vikings and then the Basques and then the Portuguese, you know, kind of sailing across the North Atlantic to get to the Grand Banks. And I think that Mark Kurlansky has done, you know, really kind of good work, again, on the edge of history, and a lot of historians don't want to, you know, oh, he's a journalist, you know, so
maybe that's why the Swedish were the first to enter into treaties with pirates,
Mhm.
that, northern effect.
Yeah.
I was kind of curious too, because Graeber mentions the ranters
Mhm.
and that kind of philosophical influence of kind of
Mhm.
anti-property type
And I
of
think he
thing.
references Christopher Hill when he does that. Yeah.
But he specifically references the European version of that. But in the mid, like I want to say 1640s, there was an incident in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that had some influence there too, but it's been ages since I've read about it. But because I know New England is of that time period is roughly your bailiwick, Dan, I'm curious if you saw any more influence of that philosophy on what could have been pirate enlightenment.
I think the whole early New England, especially Massachusetts Bay Colony thing. But yeah, I mean, with I was reading, a primary source. I think I was preparing it for next week actually, for my students, where it's Roger Williams kind of talking about the looking back on. He's writing a letter to somebody, sort of looking back on the history of his it being sort of ping ponged down the thrown out of Boston in 1635, and then he goes to what he calls Seekonk, which later becomes Rehoboth, which is actually a town I lived in. But then they come to him from Plymouth and they say, hey, you gotta cross the Seekonk River, because this is really, this is our territory and we don't want to offend Boston. So there's a lot of so the radicals, the people who kind of were socially radical, like ranters, tend to, I think, in Massachusetts Bay get kind of marginalized, right? And they because they begin almost immediately, doing things like sumptuary laws, right? What you can wear and what you can't wear, and really kind of establishing a kind of a church authority, right? Where it's almost kind of a theocracy for, and we don't really talk that much about that, but they write extensively on why it's okay to exclude heretics, and and things like that. And I think that they think of I kind of think they think of people who have these different ideas about social hierarchy as heretics, right? Because arguably Roger Williams kind of fits in that mold a little bit, and Anne Hutchinson certainly as well.
Yeah.
And John Winthrop sort of celebrates when Hutchinson, they throw her out in 1637. She goes to Rhode Island for a little while, but then she goes down to New Netherland and lives somewhere near Albany, and or she goes up to New Netherland then, and she ends up getting killed by the Mohawks, probably she and her family. And Winthrop says, he kind of celebrates that as God's vengeance on a heretic. So it's interesting. And they're burning. In addition to witches, the Bostonians are killing Quakers. So.
Yeah. Well, it's almost, and if I remember, the Ranters episode there was probably about 40 or 50 years before the Salem witch trials.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, and
well, and so then in that case, it's in the period of the Civil War, right? And so, so the English Civil War is, 1640 to 1650, and then you've got 10 years of Cromwell's, or 9 years of Cromwell's Commonwealth. And during the Civil War, a lot of really, really aggressive Puritans go back so that they can fight on the parliamentary side. And so that would make sense that they're, that these, that ranting and leveling and all of these kind of socially radical things that are happening in England are, and are suppressed actually by Cromwell, are kind of similarly reacted to similarly in Boston.
But it always impresses me too when modern politicians on the super far right throw out phrases like, we don't want Sharia law here. And yet, to a great extent, a lot of our own is, radical religious movement in that direction. But even more hilarious, I think the word sheriff
Mhm.
actually derives from Sharia, going back to, European movements into reclaim the Holy Lands. They saw political and, police force action there. And when they went back, they took those ideas with them.
Yeah.
So we, to a great extent, you can directly say we actually do have Sharia law, and we actually use the word in
Right.
our police force
That is ironic.
mentions in modern language.
Right. Yeah. So we get that and sugar from the Crusade, right? It's so yeah, the wanderings of Marco Polo. Tim is mentioning in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I just read. Did we talk about it here, or did I just happen in the last week or so? Somebody sent me an article challenging the idea that Marco Polo ever made it all the way to China, or whether he was actually plagiarizing Muslim accounts. And and the Treaty of Tordesillas, I love talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas, right? So you've got this, I mean, because because again, it's fascinating people, right? Rodrigo Borgia, the progenitor of the Italian poisoners, right, who is a Spaniard and becomes Alexander the Sixth and is an ally of Ferdinand, and I think especially Isabella. And yeah, the whole, I've actually been, as I've been sort of working on, and especially this thing that I'm doing in Skrintle, where I'm doing the timeline and the additional stuff above the timeline that has the chronological stuff, I've actually been sort of thinking of having tracks, that will be, one of them would be kind of the religious chronology. And that strikes me as, I mean, but I have to sort of think, I have to sort of try to get outside myself and think critically about that, and and check myself a little, because I tend to go kind of anti-clerical when I get riled up, and but I think it's a really interesting story about that whole thing with Luther. I mean, and you could even reach back to, like, I mean, although it's 400 years back, to like St. Francis, and railing against the opulence of the Vatican and all of that, and the kind of the corruption, and then but then Luther, and then this whole European religious century of religious war that corresponds with this period of early colonization, and and influences it. I also think that we don't talk enough about the Dutch, and especially about the Swedes in Delaware, and all these other people who aren't there anymore.
I'm kind of curious, since you mentioned Skrintle, because he actually has a very nice little kind of parallel timeline of what's going on in Madagascar and what's going on in Europe, timeline to kind of draw the two.
Right. Which I noticed, but I haven't really stared at.
It's back in the appendix.
Yeah.
At the end. But you mentioned Skrintle and kind of creating those sorts of timelines, which I think can be useful tools, but they're hard to do in kind of UI. The UI of doing it on screen is not always easy, and I've used the Night Project's Timeline JS tool before, which lets you use kind of a Google Docs spreadsheet to put in data, and then you can add photos and stuff and look at it as a timeline back and forth. But I'm kind of curious if you've played around with canvas and doing those types of maps or timelines yet, now that it kind of broadly exists.
Yeah, well, I haven't yet, and partially it's been just due to time. Initially, it was due to just being a little peeved that I sort of was perceiving it as a blocking maneuver. But I guess it's real, and I should. Yeah, I do think. I mean, as I'm just kind of glancing at the appendix, John Locke. The first European thing, which is, and I think Graeber, probably when he was writing that, or his successors, if he didn't write the timeline, probably thought, yeah, there's a lot more that could be said there too, right? Because John Locke is not really, we think of him, I mean, historically in US history, we often think of him as a starting point, right? But he's the end point of that whole dawn of everything conversation. And also, you've got the two treatises on government, but you've also got the Charter of the Carolinas, right, which is a whole different thing, and seems to suggest a kind of a different theory of government in practice than the one that he's talking about in theory. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that would be fun to unpack.
That the South Carolina bit reminds me too, because he uses as a kind of section separator within chapters a crescent moon as the visual cue in the physical book. I don't think it appears in the digital copy that I got. But I recall that the sons of the slave traders in the islands, they didn't have space to grow and expand. So when your sons grow up, unless you're dead, they have nothing to inherit and there's nowhere to go.
Right.
So in a general sense, they all left the islands and went and settled in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And the heraldic symbol of the crescent is essentially representative of the first son. And as a result, that is the symbol that appears on the South Carolina state flag.
Mm-hmm.
But there also is kind of a symbology of that crescent within the Muslim historical space, which I have no idea what its longer history and representation is, but at least with respect to kind of the South Carolina coast and piracy and slavery, I get that link, but I'm curious what other symbological links that may have, other than, hey, maybe we just needed a paragraph separator, so let's throw this in because it kind of fits.
Well, and it was available in the type box or whatever. Yeah. No, I think South Carolina is interesting because a lot of Barbados planters or sons of Barbados planters go, and that does bring the whole. I mean, and Barbados has slave codes in the middle of the 17th century. So, and then, and Barbados continues. I mean, Barbados is the place, it's the most important. I actually have a quiz question for my class where I say, what is the most important 17th century British possession? And I give them, it's multiple choice. So I give them, Jamestown, Boston, but it's Barbados, until, 1655 when Admiral William Penn helps them take Jamaica. We don't pay enough attention to, we really don't pay enough attention to the Caribbean in American history.
There's that Dutch to New York and New York to Barbados triangle in a sense, which fits into the old governmental hierarchical structures versus these new emerging, pirate democracy.
Right. Right, and in the charter, in the thing, what are they called? The freedoms or the batch of patroon oriented exemptions that the Dutch West India Company writes out. You know, they do, one of the things they say is that you're free to trade from Newfoundland to Florida as long as the trade comes back to Manhattan and gets and pays a 5% duty before it goes on. So it's the beginning, you know, it's also kind of the beginning of navigation acts.
Yeah. Or how do you maintain your political and financial centers
Yeah,
for centuries?
right. Tim.
But one of the things that we've all said about the timeline at the back, I've only got it digitally, so I've only got a column or two. I don't know what you're looking at particularly. But the other thing that so I've got a digital version of that. So there's no actual line or graphics. It's just two columns.
Right.
One of the things with this reading that I've realised that I knew, but I hadn't joined the dots up as you like that, is, of course, although this book finishes a little earlier, the truthful states, as I said, 1820,
Right.
is therefore just after Napoleon,
Yes.
which is outside of sort of World War II and stuff, and World War One. The only time that the British stroke English have last time interfered, inverted commas, in Europe, direct. But all of this starts back in Elizabethan points, in privateer, freibooter,
Right.
etc.
That
covers the whole span of the Protestants versus Catholic type issues as well. It's all linked.
Yeah.
It also covers, we've also covered like the first 2/3, because I mentioned it once already, the James Cavell Asian saga,
right,
which goes up to the Midnight Restoration and beyond, with King Rat and Taipan in Hong Kong.
Right. Well, then the Noble, in the modern, in the 50s or 60s.
Say again?
And then the Noble House in the 50s or 60s in Hong Kong. Yeah.
60s and 70s, I think you'll find.
Yeah.
Whirlwind was the last one, which was the Iranian Revolution.
Oh,
So
I forgot about that. Yeah. Right. Yep.
Yeah. So that was written after. But I found, aside from, as I say, with Shogun, which is the old, although it's not the first book to be published, it's the oldest in the continuity. Although he takes two separate things and makes them one.
Right.
His use of histories, I felt, was good for dramatic purposes, and it makes a really good story, right? But it also shows up elements of where the racism came from and all the rest of it. And obviously a lot of it starts from this treaty, as in, let's go left Portuguese, go right Spanish, except for what you've got already, right? Etc. etc. And when you go and look, you know, when I was last but one time in the Vatican Museum, the map, but not the treaty, was on display, and it's literally just a line.
Yeah, 47 degrees, right? Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, whatever the number was. It's just literally a line.
Yeah,
and it's like, the map's not bad. It's clearly not correct,
right?
Because it's right, but it's not far off, and it's like literally. And of course, not so much here, but my first ventures into the Middle East, this is, you know, Israel, Jordan, and there's a line drawn into the sand by an Englishman and a Frenchman.
Oh yeah, Sykes-Picot. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and all the crap that comes out of Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell and all that. And it's just how relatively tight some of this is.
Mhm.
You know,
Yep.
there are still instances of people in areas of Somerset don't like what happens in Westminster, not because of what actually happens in Westminster, but because they're still royalists.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, the whole. I mean, and then because the Spaniards get what's west of the line, right? They can't slave in. On the west coast of Africa because the Portuguese own it, right? So they established the Asiento, and then it and then the British pick it up in whatever it is, 1715, right? And then you get the South Sea Bubble in 1725. So it's all connected.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The sheer number of and as I say, I've read bits. Read with intention, but I haven't read as a program of intention. It's just random bits over the last 40 years that just generally up. And the conversation stroke reading here has sort of joined a lot of it up, much more than it had before.
Yeah.
But I sort of half wonder when you see things that are relatively front and center culturally, and then you pick up this book, or you pick up Graeber's earlier book, or you even pick up the one about Americans don't understand poverty.
Yeah, right.
Whereby it's taking what is known, it's not secret, etc. It's just not well known enough to be discussed down the pub. You know? Whereas so many of the elements of day-to-day, not so much lawmaking, but why is the law the way round it is? Now with the internet, everywhere's round the corner. And in theory, you can always find something. It may not be perfectly right, but you've got another dot to put in the chain to see where it was. I mean, I didn't know about the Dartmoor Act. I only knew about the pathways that they had to be walked periodically because the Ramblers Association, a bit like Sierra Club, actually puts out a diary set. These pathways are at risk. Please go walk them.
Oh, wow.
Every year.
Yeah.
And of course, we've probably got the most mapped countryside going. You know, we've got walking maps at 2.5 inches to a mile.
Right.
You know, there's nothing you can't put on there. You know,
right.
Including the greenhouse sort of thing. So, and they're freely available. They've been freely available. I mean, I can't remember a time ever. You know, you say about things like, you know, Area 51 or the Pentagon or whatever are not on the map. There's virtually nowhere in the UK like that. There's a few bits that are a bit hazy, but you could still. I mean, the most stupid thing I thought was GCHQ, our NSA, used to be in a whole series of end of war, early Cold War buildings scattered in a campus just outside Cheltenham. Innocuously looking, they look the same as a lot of other buildings at the same period of time. And yes, okay, it's a Bletchley Park copy, but it wouldn't go noticed. What do they replace it with? They replace it with a donut that looks like Applehead water.
Well, and I've always been impressed with that building that MI6 is supposed to be in along the Thames.
Yeah, exactly. And where the MI6 building is, if you look across the river, there's Thames House, which looks like a London building, which MI6. Well, the Thames House is MI5.
That's perfect. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, you know, these things that were on the edge of attention, what you were talking about earlier, you know, that sort of that don't get mentioned. You know, that fascinates me quite a bit. You know, that idea of things that are known but aren't focused on. And
Yeah. And the other thing that comes out like that is the crimes that were known that
Mhm.
are not talked about.
Yeah.
And the obvious classic is the paedophilia at BBC and in British politics, all hidden behind the police screen, because we've investigated, there's nothing to say, and yet there is. It's just in the same vein as forgotten what his name is now, Hoover and the FBI just collected information and never acted on 99% of it because
but they had
just
leverage. They used it as leverage. Yeah.
because they wanted it as leverage. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you mean my budget's not approved? Look at these photos.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the same with film. It's the same problem with filming.
Mhm.
They knew enough to nick it,
Right.
except it can't possibly be because he's one of us.
Yeah, Chris.
Right? So the closure of that,
Your thesis of-
and I've got to go.
Okay.
There's a British journalist wrote a short book which became a small mini TV series called A Very British Coup,
Oh
with
yeah.
Ray McAnally as the Prime Minister, a steel worker from Sheffield, his little catchphrase. There's a scene in there where the man from the security, they don't say 5 or 6, it's just the security, has convinced him to resign.
Mm.
And he will give a speech that is already being agreed, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
And on leaving, there's a point where Brown, with an E on the end, as a security man, turns to Perkins, the Prime Minister, and says, "My ancestors have been fighting for this since the Middle Ages." As he goes out, he uncrosses his fingers from behind him, having agreed to say what he's going to say, which he doesn't. In the mini series, says, "Yes, but don't forget, I have ancestors too." And of course, he's going to turn around and go, "What?" Talking to whichever Henry III or second, or whichever it was, back in the day, all the way through the Labour Liberation Toll Bottle Martyrs and the massacre at on the Manchester field at Piccadilly.
Peterloo. Yeah. Peterloo.
Yeah. So the riot act was read and the yeomanry came through with a sabre charge.
Yeah.
And there wasn't that many so say die in that. And then there, obviously with the Gandhi thing, there's the massacre at Amritsar where they just blocked the entrances and put a couple of machine guns up and fired into the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't count. Brown people versus English people.
Yeah.
Anyway, see you all next week. Oh, one thing I would say, we need to start building that list of what book next, because this one's going to go.
This one's short. Yeah. Good point.
Right.
All right.
I wholly second Chris's monologue from now on for choices of the next book.
Okay. See you later, Tim.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Your thesis, Dan, about what we focus on in history is an interesting one, and I've been kind of watching bits and pieces of that general idea for the last 6 or 8 months. But one of the things I noticed too is not within history, but within philosophy, certainly, we talk about and think about the big shifts and the radical thinkers way more often than we do the workaday thing. So when a new philosophy comes up, you almost throughout the history of philosophy, it's who's making the break with what happened before,
Right.
and that becomes the new thing that we study. Or even in news and newspapers, with the shift to Trump, journalism took a huge hit because we're not watching out for what the everyday person is thinking, or even the pollsters are not able to find and capture. the news is only reporting the novel and the different rather than necessarily the everyday. So what's happening in the center or the everyday, and we don't pay enough attention to that or don't have an eye into it.
Yeah. Well, and we've so thoroughly sort of internalized Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigms and revolutions in thought like that, that you have this thing that has all of this, inertia and anomalies build and build and build and build, and then boom, it comes crashing down and gets replaced by something else. And having accepted that, yeah, then I mean we've set ourselves up for this idea that that there can't be evolution, right? And there can't be gradual shift, and there can't be influences coming from a lot of different directions rather than just this one thing.
I actually saw an interesting journal article this week that I have skimmed through but haven't delved into heavily, but it's a digital humanist who has looked back at extant abolitionist newspapers in the lead up for the 50 years or so into the Civil War. And there are groups they weren't always published regularly. Sometimes they would be 1 or 2 issues of a thing and they would circulate around, but they would influence other newspapers that would either republish or kind of reframe an article with their own perspective. But she created I want to say she was from Emory and working with a couple of
I'd be interested in looking at that.
Scientists that were doing like semantic meanings of specific words and words that went outside of that with like word2vec. So they were looking at kind of who are the leaders within this group of papers and who were the followers. And they were doing word semantic analysis of trying to figure out who was influencing who based on the words they were using and the semantic shift of meanings of words like abolition. It may mean one thing to white women publishing a newspaper in the South versus an African American centric newspaper like Douglas's newspapers, who have a broader definition of not just freedom meaning from slavery, but what comes after that. How do we kind of take in new meanings of our freedom? Do we get the other follow-on things that come with not just being bound in manacles, but can we actually take part in society after that?
Right. Well, and that whole issue, I mean, that debate between wage slavery that they which the Southerners are talking about and criticizing the North for, and our understanding that, well, it's just an excuse, and not a legitimate kind of a critique of something that is new and not at all what people were expecting, who had sort of bought into Jefferson's vision, his myth, at least. I think that's I've so far in my career sort of pursued that from the perspective of what were the secularists doing, right? What were the free thinkers or the free, they call themselves free inquirers, doing, right? Because Robert Dale Owen and especially Francis Wright, who I think is a really interesting character, right? Francis Wright had this incredibly idealistic and sort of unrealistic plan when she was in her 20s on how she was going to free all of the slaves of the South without financial impact on the slave owners, right? So certainly not something that was, she thought she had done the math, but it didn't, it sort of didn't work out. But yeah, I think that, so I've been kind of interested in, how does that, how is that expressed by people who are also expressing, because that whole free inquirer moment happens at the same time that the working man's associations, are getting together in like New York City, right? And then so how does that, but then the working man thing kind of is adjacent to or is right up against Tammany Hall for a while. And so, that's not what I normally think of when I think of Tammany Hall. So how are all these things? Yeah, how do these things change over time based
Well,
on?
and there's some of that is socioeconomic because it's all happening in the Industrial Revolution where people are having more free time to be free thinkers and spend that time rather than being subsistence farmers and
Right.
having issues versus Tammany Hall is a whole different socioeconomic group of people who are almost holding on to the old ways or old methods.
Well, at least it mobilizes that group of people, yeah, as its political base. Yeah.
So it's Tammany Hall is targeting a different socioeconomic group of people who are having a trouble fitting into that new go to a day job and work and do a thing and then have some free time to yourself.
Well, and also, right, and also there's Irishness, which is, at this time the Irish aren't white, and there's Protestantism versus Catholicism. There's Americanism. There's a whole know nothing, American Party thing that I thought was sort of brilliantly fictionally examined in Gangs of New York. But it hasn't been well enough, kind of understood. Other things that I think about that I jotted down earlier when I think you were talking, Chris, about when you were responding to what I had said about South Carolina. The other thing that and I was, I guess, bouncing off of, what Tim was talking about Clavel's fiction is, Oglethorpe and Georgia, and the whole ending of Black Sails, right? You've got this, kind of this utopian, vision for, for Georgia as well, that this is going to be a place where, where people will be, it'll be a refuge and, and the English poor, can kind of come over here. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, and then what happens, and then what happens? It's the same thing, kind of what happens to the Carolinas, right? The restoration, colonies, and the whole, I mean, in 1729, they split into North Carolina and South Carolina because the people who are up in the pine forests are not the same people as the ones who are down, in the, raising indigo and rice in the South. Nate, do we buy in the notes in the chat, probably the last thing we should talk about? Do we buy Graeber's observation that workaday folks from different cultures forced together via piracy and also other things probably were the ones to generate, and forced into considering seriously the social organization of Native Americans and stuff like that? Yeah, I totally buy that. The idea that these ideas that we now call the Enlightenment have a wider origin and a less elite origin. Sure. What about?
I mean, I was just kind of trying to connect with like Chris's idea about like, with changes in philosophy just being linked to like who are, the big dogs thinking the deep philosophical thoughts and how are they related to or contrary to the other big figures that have come before them. But it's like, I think a lot of times, I mean, maybe, Chris, you probably know this a lot better than I would, like, the philosophers like have the platform and maybe like the ability to observe critically, but I feel like a lot of their insights probably did not originate with them, maybe. And I think this might be an interesting line for that, right? Like,
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah, I
That,
don't,
and I was kind of losing the thread a little bit because my history is not so good, and I was like trying to play the game in my mind, like how can I connect this back to something that makes sense to me? So
well, I don't think we've got, or at least I haven't gotten far enough into the book yet to know that he ties it together. But I've also got the context of the dawn of history, where he has done a significant amount of that work to show that kind of erasure of cultures.
Mhm.
I don't remember I'll have to pull up the reference, but there is another significant philosopher in that area who has written or who wrote a book about education and shifts in education that then has played out over the last 200 or 300 years. And I'm almost certain that it follows that same path of kind of Candia Rock into Enlightenment Europe and philosophers kind of erasing the original writers and thinkers. And even Candia Rock he was himself and he was the vessel through which it stemmed, but his philosophy wasn't his philosophy, it was
He
the
didn't invent
philosophy
it,
of the culture
right?
of which he came through. So we not only erase Candia Rock, but we also erase the culture from which it sprang. And it more likely than not was the case that usually in those societies and cultures, you were much better about citing who you knew those things from and how you knew them. And I see definite equivalences there to indigenous peoples in Australia who are incredibly rigid about doing that, to the point that Western researchers who are embedded in those cultures also do that same practice. And they specifically say, not only because they're Westerner citing in a Western tradition, but they see how the indigenous people around them defer to their elders, not because they're older the way the West would, but because the cultural structure of the indigenous people dictates that that's how it's done. You cite how you know a thing through the person who knew it before you. And generally, there are oral methods by which you can follow that chain and probably cite 5 or 6 generations back, if not much, much further. Because those are the important things within your society and your culture. I've been reading, appears a little bit here because I have it on the shelf. The other one I'm reading a digital copy, but this is a book called Astronomy Sky Country, and it's a series of books from, was it Thames and Hudson, about first knowledges. And it's people who are in Western style universities, but who happen to be indigenous people studying astronomy. So they're drawing from the Western astronomical tradition with physics and astrophysics and matching that up with their personal knowledge of astronomy within their own culture to create kind of this third archive. But they'll very specifically say, I know this thing from this elder, or it came from this elder who is who is 10 times more an expert than I'll ever be because I'm 20 or 30 and they're in their 60s and they've been doing it for ages. But that kind of continuity of knowledge is way more interesting to me than, Graeber goes through here and he has citations and he has notes, but he doesn't note it the same way that they're citing their work, which I kind of find fascinating. I may save it till next week, but I don't think we've had a West Wing reference this week. But I do remember a West Wing episode where they talk about the Dutch Vrijbreider, which is where we derive the English word freebooter. And we also derive the idea of filibuster, but I think there's a disjunct between the idea of the political filibuster comes about 100 years after all of this piracy business.
The guys
And roughly
invading
after,
Mexico and stuff. Yeah.
I think generally the Caribbean piracy had long ended and probably would have been passing out of cultural memory, or at least the immediacy of cultural memory. And then the Senate took over the idea of filibustering from that prior tradition. Not that I don't think it was, from what I have seen, I don't think it was tangled up in the idea of democracy that Graeber is kind of producing here.
Yeah, although I think it is more closely connected with all of those guys who went and invaded Latin American countries. So I think there maybe is a little bit of a connection there. I would
filibuster. I think passes in through the Spanish, or a more Spanish colonial history than it does through a British or European one.
Right. But I think there's a lot. I mean, there's so much of that going on in Latin American history. Americans, U.S. Americans, kind of intervening. The one thing that I would add to what you were saying, Chris, is not only what you're talking about there, but also how does the general public understand these ideas? And this kind of goes back to what Nate was talking about. Not only these elite people who are having, who are putting stakes in the ground, and that we're, because we like great men and paradigm shifts and all of that, we're saying, okay, this was Freud, this was Marx, this was Darwin, right? But then also, how does that, how do those insights, either correctly or incorrectly or semi-correctly, right? How do they get understood in, academic culture, popular culture, all the way down into the zeitgeist. I think that's super interesting.
And then they are not necessarily, all these writers were people who crystallized the ideas in a book that sat still.
Right.
While the people who come after them are then interpreting and reinterpreting what that book says.
Yeah.
And doing it usually for their own means and ends. So, a very popular one, and it drives me bonkers to sit in coffee shops where two people are having a little Bible study discussion next to me, and they are interpreting the words of 1st through 4th century philosophers through and only through the lens of their modern context, rather than any semblance of 1st century,
right?
Philosophy and times and traditions. They don't even draw the same thing. So it's, here are the words, and here's what those words mean to me now. And doing that, you can totally draw all of the wrong conclusions. Because
so do you interject, Chris? Are you like, actually?
I know from experience there is nothing to be gained from those interjections. So I do. But what I find interesting is a lot of, so in a good concrete example is Bart Ehrman comes from a very kind of far right religious experience in the South. If I remember, he goes to, he moves up through the academic elite and is studying with probably one of the biggest biblical scholars at Harvard in the last century. But in learning the history and the context, he realizes I'm not really a religious person anymore the way I used to be, and I can't possibly because the framing that I grew up with in the religion that I learned from the Bible and the way it was practiced is patently not what the words and the history and the context that it all comes from is. And I think as a result, a lot of people will go to seminary school, and then when they learn that religion and culture and context, realize they're getting it all wrong.
Well, much less when they read the whole book instead of just, you know, the things that are in the weekly cycle of
or the synoptic, you know, conclusions that you pull out from but a lot of people go to seminary and become far less fervent religious people because they now then have studied and have more of that context.
Yeah. Well, and
they become preachers, and the cycle continues.
Right.
You've spent all this time and effort and done the work, and you still need a day job. So you go do that thing that you grew up seeing and doing, and you don't fix the problem along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of people like Darwin, right? And are you familiar with the book Victorian Sensation? I think the author was Secord. It's kind of about
the name, but I haven't read it.
It's kind of about Chambers's vestiges of the history of creation, or whatever it's called. Chambers' Vestiges, which was a book about evolution that he published in 1844. Chambers was an encyclopedist from Scotland, right? And you know, so it was sort of for a popular audience, but it was, you know, it basically scared Darwin to the reaction to it, because he published it anonymously and it got trashed, and it scared Darwin to death. And so On the Origin of Species stayed in the drawer for another 15 years. But that whole story, I mean, if we're talking about ideas, you know, and synthesis, you know, yeah, I think it's an interesting, you know, I mean, because, you know, Erasmus Darwin wrote, you know, Zoonomia, right, which is, you know, a poem about evolution. So what is that? I don't know that. What is that? What are you?
Is that the 1902? Well, it's probably not the 1902-ish.
It's Mutual Aid by Kropotkin, but it's a new version that has been
cover.
It's been like illuminated.
Oh my god.
Yeah, it's
well, is this
really
an old version illuminated or a new edition and somebody's added illuminations to it?
Someone, I think this is from like 2020. Like someone recently illuminated it.
I'm gonna put that on my wish list. That is pretty.
2021, yeah. But it is. I mean,
is there a
I'm not sure
edition of it?
This is a soft cover. I don't know if a hardcover exists.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna re-illuminate a book like that, it definitely needs to come in a hardcover edition.
Right.
I'm gonna.
Well, it's not. It doesn't count as illuminated if it's not in color.
Yeah.
Like, man, it's the. I'll put a link to the artist in the chat. It's Enno Bonzo. But they've done a lot of work in kind of a similar vein. But it's pretty ambitious, and the illustrations are awesome.
It doesn't.
But why I pulled that up? I mean, it was handy. But I had no idea that like Kropotkin picks up the thread
response to
from
Darwin. Yeah. That's cool. I searched for it on Amazon. I did not find that cover, but I'll look for it, because that looks like that would be fun. And I've been looking for an excuse to read Kropotkin.
It's weird, and I think there's been one reference here in this group, but I've seen about 4 other tangential references to him in the last 6 months. So it's almost as if he's having a renaissance like this year
Yeah.
And I'd not be surprised to see like 10 more references to him in the next 6 or 8 months.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I think he, it's part of what people are looking for,
Mhm, mhm. Wow, this is a crazy website that you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's their
Yeah.
artist's website.
Yeah,
Um,
that's cool.
and then I just dropped a link to the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, maybe we should think about. So I just reopened. I wanted to pull out a passage and make some notes from this economic history or slash history of economics course that I'm co-teaching this semester from on fetishism or fetishization, and so I pulled out rather than going to Marx, which I didn't think that students would be able to understand. I went to Alf Hornborg's book, Power of the Machine, and I actually, and that was kind of interesting for me because I found that I had written, and this was, I read this in like 2011 before I had any type of note making process or thing, but I've got highlights, I've got handwritten notes in the margins, I've got all of this stuff. And I thought, oh man, I need to go back and kind of go through this, and hate to use the word process, but kind of do something with this, because I don't know if you're familiar with Hornborg. He tries to, and I'm not 100%, I don't 100% buy him, but he tries to kind of combine Marxian thought with thermodynamics. And so, and so he's sort of like an environmental economic philosopher, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff. Anyways, it's noon again, and we're down to 3, so we should probably.
We're down to 3.
all the
Can
good
I?
stuff happens now.
I know, right?
I just actually threw a link to a Kropotkin reference in an old David Graeber article about
Oh, cool.
neo-Darwinism, which is interesting.
Thank you.
But it was something I ran into like 2 weeks ago, I think. It was like, I know I saw a Graeber Kropotkin reference somewhere, and sure enough, in my notes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I mean, maybe he's mentioned it in other things more directly, but I think Graeber comes straight out and says that he was like super influenced by Kropotkin.
Yeah, I think so.
So since we're going to rip through this real quick, and it seems like there's not at least a clear consensus on next book. The one that you suggested, Chris, looks super interesting, but it doesn't come out until April, right?
Yeah, it's a ways off. So we'll have to have something between now and then, certainly. But
I was wondering, especially since I've been out of the loop for a while, and it seems like y'all have done a lot of really interesting stuff, if maybe the 25th of February or maybe the 4th of March could be like a hey, and it's like this is like the 7th Obsidian Book Club now, Dan?
Yeah, I think it is.
If maybe people would want to do like 10 or 15 minutes and be like, hey, this is how my thinking on note making has evolved over time, or this is what I'm doing with it now. I think that would be really fun.
Yeah, I like that idea. Cool. Okay, so people watching this on YouTube who didn't stick around to the end, comment on that. or is it YouTube anymore? It was, I guess I put it on Vimeo. Maybe I should put it on YouTube, because I got a lot of mixed responses to my
the one benefit I find for YouTube is there are tools for stripping audio out of the video. So I can easily strip this out and re-listen to it as a podcast in the middle of the week.
Oh, okay.
Scribble down the 3 interesting thoughts that I missed or to review over it. And Vimeo, I don't think has that facility.
No, probably not. And do you have premium, or is that just a basic feature?
No, it's somebody has been, and they turned it off a while ago, but there's a GitHub repo that does all kinds of fun things for ripping YouTube videos into other formats. So I use a service called huffduffer.com, and it essentially is an audio bookmarking service. So when I see something that's audio that's like an hour or two long, or a podcast that I want to listen to but I don't have time for, I'll bookmark it on that. Or a YouTube video that I don't necessarily need to see the visuals and I want the audio.
Right.
I can bookmark it with that, and it will strip out all the metadata and give me an audio file as well as an RSS feed in 20 different ways. It gives you RSS feeds for everything the Surface does.
Cool.
So usually what I do is I have the RSS feed for my account piped into my podcatcher, so that when I'm commuting or driving around, I just like, oh, what have I seen lately? And push play on something recent that I know I wanted to listen to.
Right.
And it just has the audio is built in for it automatically.
That is super cool. Yeah.
It's reliant on a feature of YouTube that doesn't exist in Vimeo as far as I know. So things like your Peppermint series, I was able to strip out the audio and turn it into an audio book essentially. So all that work you've done, you could use that and strip the audio files out, save them, download them, and say, here's the audiobook version of my.
I was planning on doing that with my Knowlton biography. I didn't think anybody was listening to the Peppermint book, so I stopped. But maybe I'll return to it.
I got big chunks of it, or that, and the your note taking book you did roughly kind of the same. I haven't done it with Knowlton yet, although I kind of want to do that. And then the benefit is my MP3 player will speed up.
Right. Yeah. So you can listen to it at 1.5, and you don't lose anything. Right. Cool. Well, I'll look into that. Because that would
when you've already done all that work, just use a tool to strip the audio out and
So a hack that I've used to great effect is go to the YouTube video, turn on the auto subtitles, which are often kind of garbage, but then it'll generate the auto text for the whole thing, and then you can copy paste that into a doc. And then especially like if I'm trying to, it's like I know this happens, but I don't know when or where, then I can use the transcript, and then I don't have to listen to like a 2-hour long podcast anymore.
I've used Otter, but then I decided not to pay for it, so I don't have that anymore. But what I was doing is I was just dragging my videos into Vector, and that was just creating MP3s for it. Thank you. I'll add that to the I'll add that to the things I'm looking at this week. Thank you.
Yeah, when I annotate YouTube videos, I use DocDrop, and it gives you the text, and you can click on it and it'll jump to that place in the video too, which is nice. But then you've got text you can annotate to link your notes to certain parts of the videos.
Wow.
You want to do that.
The wonders of modern technology. Great. Well, on that note, next week, section 2. And and then so we'll be done with this in a few more weeks, and we'll pick another. Yeah, and I haven't actually kind of gone to that page in Obsidian recently and seen what people are voting on. But yeah, we'll start talking about that more actively probably next week.
I rearranged it so the ones that have more votes, I think, are towards the top.
Oh, thank you.
Probably could use some gardening, I think.
All right. Good enough. All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a good week.
See you next Saturday.
Take care.
See you guys. Take care.